or no other reason, it's good to be back. Thank you, Charlotte. The lectionary has us for a few Sundays in a row in the first book of Peter. Not a book that gets a whole lot of press. And I do remember 3 years ago when we were at this point in the lectionary that I didn't go through 1 Peter, but this time around I wanted us to hear some really important concerns of what this epistle has to say. Our passage today begins in 1 Peter chapter 2, but I do want to read the very first verse of the book, where we read, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. With that in mind, we read something of what Peter says to those who live in exile in chapter 2. Rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, or hypocrisy, some translations say, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, see, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. To you then who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. I want to read on just one more verse. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. What if you woke up one morning to discover that the entire English language had undergone drastic revision while you had slept? You insist on maintaining the old sense of words and how they once were used. So you say something like, well, good morning, dear. You look lovely. Did you rest well? Now, though, that comes across as, you have the teeth of a hippopotamus, and your smell is that of burnt cabbage. Well, such a conversation might result in confusion and perhaps a bit of tension. That twilight zone sort of possibility might seem remote, but in some ways that is what had happened for those addressed in 1 Peter. Only not merely a shift in language had occurred, and it is Christians who experience the shift to the new, while everyone else continues to operate with an older set of assumptions. If a radical shift in the use of words like good and morning and lovely were to take place overnight, we would seek some explanation of that. How could such a thing take place? The Christians to whom Peter writes might be asking themselves similar questions. Why, they might ask themselves, for example. Why are we who once knew privilege and status in our communities now subject to suspicion? A major concern in 1 Peter is to address the issue of suffering. Now that might seem like a very timely topic right now. We're in the middle of a great crisis, and it is nationwide and it is worldwide. What Peter offers, though, is less an effort to explain and help us negotiate suffering in general. Now, there's plenty in the Bible that helps along those lines, that offers encouragement and wisdom to deal with any and all sorts of different sorts of circumstances that come to us whether we like them or not. But Peter's words are addressed to those who are suffering precisely because not merely a shift in language has taken place, but for Christians a shift to the new has happened while everyone else continues to operate with an older set of assumptions. Later in chapter 4, verse 12, Peter tells us that a shift to the new inevitably brings tensions and conflicts with the old. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. And so as an eager shepherd, Peter seeks to do what our passage says God is concerned to do, to build believers into a spiritual house. Peter is concerned to strengthen, to edify, and to help us become more solid and stable in our faith in a world where tensions and conflicts are going to persist between the old and the new until the new is the only thing left standing. Now, the way Peter goes about this effort at house building is by making clear to believers our identity as those who belong to Christ. Peter affirms that we are who we are because Jesus Christ is who he is. And he does this in a rather remarkable way here in 1 Peter 2. Everything he says in this passage depends upon the reality offered in verses 4 and 5. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Christ, Peter says, is the living stone. And as those who come to Christ, we too are living stones. We are who we are because Jesus Christ is who he is. Now, why does Peter speak of Christ as this living stone? Well, he quotes repeatedly here from the Old Testament to emphasize that everything that the temple had been for Israel finds its ultimate expression in Christ. The place of worship, the place of sacrifice, the place of communion and intersection between heaven and earth. The temple served as a reminder of God's holiness and of the world's need for God's grace and forgiveness. All of that, Peter says, is found in the cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. At the same time, though, Peter says that this is the stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. The cornerstone, the solid, sure foundation on which all depends, is the measure by which the new is to be assessed. He is the test for what counts as precious. There were those who called for his death, and those still today who take offense that the Christ of the cross, the suffering servant, the lamb that was slain, is the divine reference point for what counts as precious. Then and now, such a Christ is for many the stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And yet we are who we are because Christ is who he is. And if Jesus Christ is the living stone, the cornerstone, all that the temple represents for ancient Israel, so we too, like living stones, together built into a spiritual house, represent in the world all of who Christ is. Rather than a temple made with human hands, in which priests perform the rituals and offer the sacrifices, but are themselves not the sacrifices, we are those in whom all these features are joined as one. We are the building. We are the priesthood. We are the sacrifices, all bound together as living stones whose identity comes from Christ, the living stone. We are who we are because Christ is who he is. Now we need to understand something, though, that Peter makes clear, and that is the ambiguous encounter between Christ and the world at large. Some within the world at large will believe and affirm and come to him as living stone. To you then who believe, he is precious. He is the measure of value. He is the reference point for all that is good and to be treasured. But what else does Peter say? But for those who do not believe, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. As an eager shepherd, Peter seeks to do what our passage says God seeks to do. Build believers into a spiritual house to strengthen, to edify, and to help us become more solid and more stable in our faith. But you cannot do that if you're not honest with people. And so Peter does not offer happy talk to give a false sense of security, pretending that everything is just fine and that all the apparent problems will soon just disappear. So what will he say? In just one place there in chapter 4, verse 12, but it is a persistent theme throughout 1 Peter. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you, he says. Now what Peter does do is he explains why this is happening. If we are who we are because Christ is who he is, if he embodies all the temple was to be for ancient Israel, he is also the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. But what will that mean for those who, as living stones, come to this living stone, the one who was rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight? Are we to imagine that to have our identity defined by Christ, to be in the world as Christ is, the place of worship, the place of sacrifice, the place of communion and intersection between heaven and earth? Are we to imagine that our presence will not also border on the ambiguous? This is not just any old ambiguity, though. It will be the ambiguity of a tension between what God values, what God considers precious, and what a world might reject. And Peter knows that he must strengthen, he must build up, he must remind us of our identity. And he does this because we are those whom he describes as newborn infants, new life. We are those who've been granted new life in Christ. And he is taking pains in this passage to underscore what that means. That we are who we are because Christ is who he is. Now, why is that so vital? It's because we cannot separate character and conduct from identity. Enough of this nonsense where the mother of the axe murderer says something like, well, but deep down he's a sweet boy. How we live is the clearest marker of who we are. Now, it's not that that we never betray ourselves or that we never act out of character, but we do know this, that the coward is going to eventually show himself to be a coward. The true colors of the gracious are eventually going to shine through. And it is the correspondence between character, conduct, and identity that becomes most obvious when times are difficult. We have this old saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's just one way of reminding us that it is those difficult times that reveal us for who we are. As an eager shepherd, Peter seeks to do what God is concerned to do, to build believers into a spiritual house, to toughen, to strengthen, to help us become more solid and stable in our faith. And he does this by giving us a new language. Stones are not mere stones, but living, breathing, vital components of a spiritual house. Priests are no longer a select few among God's people, but we all together constitute a priesthood. Sacrifices are not something that can be offered apart from personal investment, but are now defined precisely by personal investment. That's what Peter is talking about at the very beginning of this passage when he says, you get rid of some things like malice and guile and insincerity, envy and all slander. But he does all of this echoing themes from the Old Testament, quoting from Isaiah, quoting from Hosea, quoting from Exodus. And all of this Old Testament stuff tells us something very important about our identity. And that even in times of challenge and difficulty, our lives are part of a larger story. The story of God's work that started way back then, moved on through the people of Israel, finds its supreme expression in the coming of Christ, and now continues on amongst his people. Our lives are part of a larger story, the story of God's work that moves from creation to new creation. And that is why, in verse 9, Peter will echo Exodus chapter 19, words that were addressed first to Moses to speak to the people of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai. And there God tells Moses that the people of Israel are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. Now, Peter says that is us. That what was addressed to Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai now is spoken to those who come to the living stone as living stones. If we are who we are because Christ is who he is, who is Christ? He is the living stone, rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. If that's who he is, then we who come to him as living stones are also chosen and precious in God's sight. Now, there's probably no passage in the New Testament that more clearly indicates how it is that through faith in Jesus Christ, the church inherits, participates in, and joins in the tasks and purpose of ancient Israel. And Peter intends to encourage and strengthen by these words a tested people, a people who are undergoing a fiery trial, with a reminder of our identity as a privileged people with a profound calling. Privileged to participate in covenant with God, called to the task of worship, and to proclaim, as Peter says, his excellencies, his greatness, his mighty acts, to proclaim to the rest of the world God's goodness and power. Peter's shift in language here, the shift from Exodus 19, talking to ancient Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, to the larger community that embraces all who have come to Christ, whether Jew or Gentile. Well, we need to understand this language very carefully. And we need to understand this very carefully because this language of a chosen race, a kingdom of priests, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, has suffered great distortion by ignoring to whom and why Peter writes these words. Time and again, the idea of a chosen nation, a kingdom of priests, the idea of a new Israel, severed from the Israel of old, has been used to sanction imperial designs, to give divine legitimacy to the causes of conquest. Whether it was the British Empire of the 18th century or manifest destiny of the 19th century, the language of God's chosen people, God's new Israel, has been invoked to license the immeasurable suffering of others in the faith that the cause behind their suffering was God's cause. Now, whether it's been England or America or Russia or the French or the Dutch, the Spanish, it's been done over and over and over again. They have taken Scripture's language of the chosen race, a holy nation, as justification for conquest, for acquisition, for domination at the expense of the defeated. The idea has been used for centuries, and it is still invoked today, and whenever it is invoked in error. Now, how can I be so sure that it's invoked in error? Here's where Peter once again requires us to relearn our language, to learn to speak Christian. Old words acquire new meaning. Older sets of assumptions give way to the new. Stones are not mere stones, but living stones. Priests are not limited to a select few among God's people, but all of us together constitute a priesthood. And a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, has nothing to do with the power to dominate others so that a privileged people might enjoy material advantage at the expense of other people's suffering. Our privileges are of another sort. What shift in language clarifies what it means to participate in the privileges of Israel? Well, it really is an important question to ask. What Israel does Peter have in mind? Ancient Israel existed in many different forms over many years in the Old Testament period. Israel was a wandering set of tribesmen during the days of Judah and his brothers. Israel was an enslaved people in Egypt. They became wanderers again in their wilderness journey. Israel suffered total breakdown and anarchy during the days of the Judges. For a brief period, they enjoyed the status of a relatively powerful kingdom during the days of some of their kings. Then there was Israel in exile. Time, once again, of minority status and loss, and certainly not a time of advantage. When he invokes God's promises to Israel on behalf of the Christian community, what Israel does Peter have in mind? Now, verses 9 and 10 are just wonderful. Who are we? What is our identity? Who are we because of who Christ is? We are a chosen people. We are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. We are God's own people. Apart from the reminder that these words are addressed specifically to those who have come to Christ, who is the living stone, we need to hear something else Peter says to clarify what Israel he has in mind. It's what he says in the very next verse, verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. There it is. And this is not just a passing theme in 1 Peter. It pervades the letter. Chapter 1, verse 1. Peter addresses the Christian community as the exiles of the dispersion. In chapter 1, verse 17, he reminds his readers, if you invoke as Father the one who judges all people impartially according to their deeds, live in reverent fear during the time of your exile or your sojourn as foreigners. Peter is thinking of the Christian community not as the ones who get to call the shots, not as the one who enjoy the seats of power and privilege so that we can make other people suffer for our faith. It is the height of irony that words of encouragement used to strengthen the sense of identity and calling among a people at risk, among a people living under threat, a people who were suffering on account of their faith, that those words would ever be used as a license to impose suffering on others in the name of our faith. Now, what are we to make of this new language where the chosen are exiles, where royalty live as aliens? The temptation is for us to try to pick one side or the other of this equation. Some prefer an identity that sanctions domination and suggests power and control. Others would seek an identity that offers retreat and withdrawal from a complicated world. Peter doesn't let us make that choice. We are both. We're a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. We are God's own people, called to proclaim his marvelous deeds in a world in need. We are who we are because Christ is who he is. But who is he? He is the living stone, the precious stone, chosen and precious to God, but rejected among humanity. We must celebrate our privilege and honor our calling, and at the same time affirm that our calling is not to the seats of power and status whereby we can make sure we are secure at the expense of others. We must affirm that identity that tells us we are who we are because Christ is who he is. But Peter has told us who Christ is. We have come to a living stone, rejected yet chosen. As living stones, let us welcome God's work of building us, strengthening us, giving us a more solid and sure foundation for our faith, even in the midst of difficulty. Reminding us that we are that spiritual house, that temple, priesthood, sacrifices, all bound together in one identity as a people called to worship and to declare God's goodness and power. That is our privilege. And that is our task. And that is what it means to live as royalty. I don't know if there's a better hymn for us to sing that reminds us of how sure and solid Christ, the cornerstone, is, than how firm a foundation. I'd like to ask Charlotte